He endured. He held up. He was able to hang in there. He didn't faint.
He persevered. He stayed strong. He managed to endure. Él no se desmayó. Pastor Charles Stanley's family has finally spoken out about his final days. No es bonito. For 50 years, Charles Stanley shared messages about family values with millions of people. But behind closed doors, his family was breaking down. His wife asked for a divorce. His son left the church. His daughter saw everything fall apart. Now, years after his death in 2023, they are finally speaking. What they shared about his last days will surprise you. The man in the pulpit was not the same man at home, and the final 3 words he said changed everything in his relationship with his son. Charles Stanley nació el 25 de septiembre de 1953 en un pequeño pueblo en Virginia llamado Dry Fork. It was the middle of the Great Depression. When jobs disappeared, families were starving, and life seemed hopeless for millions. His parents, Charlie Stanley and Rebecca Hall, were just managing to survive. Lines for bread extended for several blocks. People lost their homes suddenly. It was the hardest time to raise a child. But somehow that rough start became the foundation for one of the strongest voices in Christian ministry to emerge. 9 months after Charles was born, everything was different. His father passed away unexpectedly at only 29 years old. Un día estaba allí, al siguiente se fue. No farewell, no memories to hold on to, just a name and quiet. His mother, Rebecca, had to raise a baby by herself during the worst economic crisis in U.S. history. Charles always felt a sense of abandonment. He often talked about growing up feeling like something was missing, thinking about who his father was and what kind of person he might have become with his father's support. That desire influenced how he would later describe God as a father who always stays, always remembers, and never turns away. When Charles was 9 years old, Rebecca got married again. She believed she was doing the right thing by providing her son with the father figure he had lost. However, that choice almost ruined them both. Her new husband, John Hall, was an alcoholic who had a temper. The nightmare started almost right away. 2 weeks after the wedding, Rebecca understood that she had ended up in a false situation. Hall's family had deceived her. They were aware that he was abusive. Le dijeron que él cambiaría si se casaba. Él no lo hizo. Even worse, Charles was afraid. He saw his stepfather suffocate his mother. Cada noche él cerraba con llave la puerta de su dormitorio. A veces él incluso tenía una pistola cargada junto a su cama por si acaso. He was a kid living in an area affected by war. That trauma didn't just leave marks on him, it shaped who he is. It showed him that surviving requires faith and that God, not people, is the only one you can really rely on. Amid all the chaos at home, Charles found safety in the church. He came from a Pentecostal background. His grandfather, George Washington Stanley, was one of the founders of the Emmanuel Pentecostal Holiness Church in Dry Fork. His parents participated actively, and Charles absorbed the passionate sermons, loud prayers, and strong emotions that were part of Pentecostal worship. On the toughest nights at home, he would go to the church basement to get away. There he prayed loudly, crying, shouting, and asking God for peace. He learned to express his feelings fully in prayer, not just say them softly. Even when he later became a Baptist, that Pentecostal spirit always stayed with him. It influenced the way he spoke, preached, and led. A lot changed when I turned 17. Charles went to see his grandfather in Siler City, North Carolina. He felt uncertain about becoming a preacher. Se sentía demasiado joven, demasiado roto, demasiado débil. But his grandfather gave him one sentence that would shape his whole life. Charles, if God asks you to put your head through that brick wall, you go for it. He is responsible for making the hole. That moment struck him like lightning. After that, his main belief became clear. Follow God's guidance and let him handle the outcomes. It was more than just a saying. Era supervivencia. When life had no answers, following the rules was what kept him steady. In the 1950s, Charles started his formal education. He began at the University of Richmond and then went to Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Fort Worth, Texas. This was a time when Bible colleges were growing rapidly. The number of students has increased 3 times since 1945. The world was changing quickly, and Christianity was discovering its new way of communicating through radio and TV. Billy Graham comenzó sus cruzadas en Milne. Evangelism was becoming a powerful movement across the country. Charles fully engaged in his studies, focusing on Greek, Hebrew, theology, and preaching. He wasn't only studying scripture, he was figuring out how to make it happen and how to connect it to people's suffering. In 1957, Charles was only 25 years old, but he was already a pastor and preaching at Fruitland Baptist Church in North Carolina. It was a small church with around 150 people in a mountain town, and it was just what he needed. He taught preaching and evangelism at the nearby Bible Institute while being a full-time pastor. Su salario, solo $75 a la semana, pero a él no le importaba. Él estaba haciendo lo que amaba. He was learning to lead, to speak, and to connect with people facing real-life challenges. Many of his members were farmers or factory workers facing poverty and uncertainty. He provided them with more than just sermons. Él les dio esperanza. In 1958, he was officially made a Baptist minister when he was only 26 years old. That was very young. Most pastors were ordained in their 30s, but Charles was prepared. He was perfectly timed. Television evangelism was growing rapidly. Billy Graham was on all the channels. Oral Roberts had just started his own TV ministry. Charles would soon come after. That same year, his ordination certificate allowed him to baptize, marry, and lead churches. But more importantly, it began a new type of ministry that would eventually connect with millions of people globally. From 1959 to 1968, Charles moved frequently, first to Fairborn, Ohio, then to Miami, Florida, and finally to Bartow, Florida. Every church brought different challenges. In Fairborn, he was in charge of a church close to a large Air Force base. The town was growing quickly because of the military buildup during the Cold War. In Miami, he led a church during the Cuban Missile Crisis and watched its membership grow from 400 to more than 800 people. But even with his success, he continued to move forward. In 1968, he started working at a smaller church in Bartow, a peaceful town with 12,000 residents. Many people would consider it a step back. For Charles, it was an opportunity to create something meaningful. He wanted to begin anew and establish strong foundations. That time of restlessness wasn't a failure. Fue un entrenamiento. He was improving his skills, learning from each community, and waiting for the moment that would change everything. When Charles Stanley first entered First Baptist Atlanta in 1969, he had no idea about the conflict he was entering. The church was divided. Groups were battling over religious beliefs and political issues. And Stanley, just the associate pastor, stood right in the middle of everything. At one meeting, things got so intense that someone hit him. Pero no se alejó. Él se quedó. For 2 long, harsh years, he faced the stress, the rumors, and the open anger. Luego llegó el 1 de octubre de 1900. On that day, the church had a vote to see if Stanley should be the senior pastor. The atmosphere in the room was tense. Emotions were intense. But when they counted the votes, the result was obvious. Sure, at 39 years old, Stanley was the 16th pastor of one of the most important churches in the South. Pero tuvo un costo. Many who disagreed with him left for good, leaving a church that was hurt and damaged, but also finally ready to make progress. Only a year later, he took an even bigger chance. In 1972, Stanley started the Chapel Hour on 2 local TV stations in Atlanta, WXIA TV 11 and Wonks 46. It was only a 30-minute show. It wasn't anything special, but it reached 16,000 local viewers, and that was enough to grab attention. Behind the scenes, Christian networks were looking for voices that seemed practical and genuine. Stanley's straightforward Bible teaching was exactly what was needed. In 1978, the Christian Broadcasting Network made contact. They were creating a new satellite system and required content. Stanley agreed. In just 1 week, his audience grew from 16,000 in Atlanta to reaching people all over the country. The program has a new name, In Touch with Dr. Charles Stanley, Una Nueva Identidad. By the early 1980s, it was being broadcast on TV in nearly every big American city. Then it became global. In the end, Stanley's message was shared in 14 languages in 150 countries. Pero su imperio mediático no comenzó con cámaras. It started in classrooms. In 1966, 5 years before he became famous on television, Stanley started the George Mueller Christian School in Miami. He was still a pastor at First Baptist Miami then. The school was not only about learning, se trataba de valores. It was named after George Mueller, a Christian leader known for helping orphans, relying only on prayer and faith. Ese nombre era importante. Stanley thought it was important to include faith in daily life, especially in how children were raised and educated. At the same time, he was completing his graduate degree while balancing school, church, and starting a school. That demonstrated the determination that would later shape his national ministry. He left Miami in 1968, moved to Bartow, Florida, and by 1969 was on his way to Atlanta. But those early years showed something. Stanley wasn't only thinking about the sermons on Sunday. He had big ideas, and that way of thinking never ended. When Stanley became the leader of First Baptist Atlanta, the church had about 5,000 members. By the 1990s, that number had tripled. La iglesia necesitaba más espacio. In 1997, he made a controversial choice. He sold the historic property in Midtown Atlanta and relocated the entire church to the suburb of Dunwoody. The new building can hold 3,000 people. It was modern, stylish, and prepared for what's to come. But Stanley didn't only care about numbers. El Cleo Programas. One of the most well-known events was the Passion Play, which is a dramatic performance of Jesus' last week. It lasted from 1977 to 2011 and had hundreds of volunteers. Under Stanley's guidance, the church turned into a powerful organization for ministry, media, and outreach. When he left in 2020, after almost 50 years, First Baptist Atlanta was more than just a church. It was a national institution. But maybe the biggest change happened in 1978, when technology helped his ministry grow. That year, CBN's satellite network transformed the Chapel Hour into In Touch and changed everything. No fue un aumento lento. In just 1 week, Stanley's face appeared in homes all over America. That level of visibility was not common for a preacher at that time. Pero a Stanley no le daba miedo estar en el centro de atención. He accepted it. In 1980s, lo hizo oficial. He created In Touch Ministries as a separate non-profit, which allowed him complete freedom to grow. Y lo hizo. Radio syndication started in that same year. Soon he was reaching more than 115 million homes in the U.S. alone. But he kept going. He ventured into the farthest areas of the planet, using technology that very few others had. He became very focused on innovation. Stanley thought that technology was more than just helpful. It was important. He wanted to reach everyone, including people in villages without electricity. He started Messenger Lab, which includes 8 different solar-powered audio devices meant for people who lack internet, electricity, and church access. One device could play 65 of his sermons, along with the New Testament, Psalms, and Proverbs, in 2 languages. Over time, more than 1 million messenger devices were distributed for free. The total amount we hear is more than $26 million. Why no solo fueron a una región? These devices reached all continents, even Antarctica. Meanwhile, Stanley's sermons were broadcast on over 4,000 platforms, including radio, TV, and satellite. He was in 127 languages. He was using mobile apps, digital platforms, podcasts, and more, all because he believed this was the best time in history to share the gospel. He was not only a major figure in the media, but also a controversial political figure. In 1984, Stanley was named president of the Southern Baptist Convention. It was one of the most debated times in the group's history. The SBC was deeply divided in a civil war about biblical inerrancy, questioning if the Bible is entirely true in every aspect, including science. Los conservadores lo llamaron el resurgimiento conservador. Moderates referred to it as a takeover. Stanley won the presidency with only 52% of the vote, just barely, but it was sufficient. He served 2 terms from 1984 to 1986. During that time, he also headed the Peace Committee, which was created in 1985 to end the conflict. The committee's report was 6,450 words long after 15 intense meetings, and it supported what Stanley and other conservatives had been saying. From that point on, the SBC took a more theologically conservative path, and Stanley was at the center of that change. Starting from a Miami school in 1966, moving to a church fight in 1971, and then building a satellite network in the 1980s, Charles Stanley always kept moving ahead. In February 1988, Charles Stanley was at the height of his public career. He had just been welcomed into the National Religious Broadcasters Hall of Fame. It was a big moment. His sermons reached over 115 million homes across America, and contacting Dr. Charles Stanley became a familiar figure on Christian radio and TV. He wasn't simply another pastor. He represented a movement and was a leader influencing the future of Christian media. But while the world was honoring him, something much more troubling was going on at home. A year later, in 1989, Stanley went to Kansas City for a ministry event. While praying in his hotel room, he looked out the window and saw many satellite dishes on the roofs nearby. At that moment, he said that God sent him a message. This is how to spread the gospel worldwide. Él recordó el Salmo 60. Share with us the news of your saving power, so we can spread it across the world. That moment changed everything. His sermons were translated into whatever 27 languages and sent out through more than 4,000 networks worldwide. But while the message was being sent out, the man behind it was falling apart. His wife Anna had been feeling more and more neglected. Charles was away more often, pursuing church growth and broadening his ministry. She once said, "He chose his priorities and I have not been one of them. Ella no estaba hablando con ida." She was talking from years of suffering. By the early 1990s, Anna had completely stopped going to his church services.
Their son Andy, who would later be a pastor of a megachurch, watched everything happen. The cold silences, the increasing distance, and the gradual end of a marriage that had lasted almost 40 years, led Anna to file for divorce in June 1993. She only used the name A.J. Stanley, not her full name, but it was clear who it was. The documents stated that their marriage was beyond repair. Evangelical groups reacted strongly. This was Charles Stanley, the man who talked about family values every Sunday, and now his own marriage was falling apart in front of everyone. The response was quick. Some pastors ignored him. Others asked him to leave the pulpit. The surprise wasn't just about the divorce.
Stanley had a reputation for the very thing he was now being accused of not doing. But the story didn't finish quickly. Anna withdrew the petition at one point, wanting to make amends. When that didn't work, she filed again in 1995. For 7 years, the Stanleys lived in a difficult situation. They were legally married but emotionally apart, and faced public attention. Christian radio stations stopped airing his sermons. Some church leaders quietly suggested that he step down. But Stanley continued to preach week after week. No solo fue perseverancia. It was an act of rebellion. The Southern Baptist Convention was not pleased. Stanley had previously been its president. Now they were asking him to resign. He had even told his own congregation years before that if he ever got divorced he would leave the ministry. Now he was divorced or almost there, and still preaching. Even some of his staff quit, including his son Andy. The divorce was completed on May 11, 2000. Charles tenía 60 años. His sermons were being shown in 50 languages, but at that moment he was no longer a husband. The man who once described Christian family values had lost his own family. Anna stayed single until she passed away in 2014. Charles did not marry again. The church rules let him remain as pastor as long as he didn't marry again. He spoke to his congregation soon after the last papers were signed. He said calmly, "God has assured me I'm where he wants me to be, doing what he has called me to do." And then the surprise was that his church strongly backed him. The board of deacons voted 35-3 to retain him. In a later interview, Stanley said something that surprised a lot of people. "I never felt like I truly divorced her. Ella lo pidió. I replied to it." That one line showed the strong feelings of denial or belief, depending on your perspective. However, not everyone was in agreement. Andy Stanley had quietly left First Baptist Atlanta several years ago. He didn't just walk away from the church. Él dejó toda la dinastía. Se suponía que él iba a heredar el púlpito. Instead, he left and started his own church. In 1995, he brought together a group of people to create North Point Community Church. It wasn't just a new building, it was a completely new way of thinking. He said that Atlanta doesn't need another church. What is needed is a safe space for those who don't go to church. It was a clear criticism of everything his father's ministry stood for. By the end of the first year, more than 4,000 people were coming to North Point. Today the church serves more than 43,000 people in various places. It was its own empire, and it was not connected to Charles Stanley. The father led one of the largest ministries in the world. The son constructed one of the biggest churches in the country, and they weren't even talking. Their fight became famous. Christian media couldn't stop discussing it. Everyone had a different explanation: an affair, mental illness, problems with control or jealousy. Whatever the reason, the silence between father and son represented all the problems with evangelical leadership. Two men who taught forgiveness, but couldn't forgive one another. In the end they tried counseling, sessions every week, and being completely honest. One day Andy asked the counselor, "When should I give up on my dad?" The counselor responded, "When your heavenly father gives up on you." That line was powerful. Little by little and with difficulty, they started to talk again. Una reunión de almuerzo lo cambió todo. Charles looked at his son and said, "I don't want us to be like all those other fathers and sons." Andy responded quietly, "Me neither, Dad." By 2013, Andy's North Point Community Church had about 30,000 members in 5 locations. It had become the second biggest church in the United States. Aún más sorprendente, his father Charles Stanley, who once felt left behind when Andy left, stood at his own pulpit and praised him publicly and passionately. That same Charles, who had previously made quiet digs at Andy during sermons, now happily informed his congregation about Andy's plans to start a new church. He even said it was okay. Charles openly confessed that those words were hard to say. The wounds were still new, but he said them anyway. That blessing signaled a big change. Years ago they could barely talk, but as time passed things changed. No solo hablaron. They gave sermons at each other's churches. The same father who once viewed his son as a troublemaker now saw him as a teammate. And Andy always remembered that. He realized he had a great opportunity while growing up, learning from one of the strongest preachers in America. Charles had been the leader of First Baptist Atlanta for more than 50 years. He had even served as president of the Southern Baptist Convention. But now he was watching his son guide a new generation. In the last months of Charles's life, everything became slower. No podía moverse mucho. He sat in a large leather chair, too weak to move around.
but his mind is still sharp, and his heart is still full of passion. Andy would come over often, and each time he knelt by that chair, they would have a conversation. Then Charles would say, "Please pray for me." This became their new way of life, a way of healing. Andy mentioned that those visits were incredibly valuable. That chair became a holy place, a sign of peace between two men who had once been far apart. Charles ya no se subía a los escenarios, ya no retumbaba desde el púlpito. But in that chair, through silent prayers, he discovered something just as strong. No siempre había sido así. Once, their dinners were quiet and uncomfortable. They would sit in restaurants, aware they needed to talk, but unsure of how to start. The divorce between Charles and Andy's mother, Anna, had broken more than just their marriage. It had weakened their relationship as father and son. Charles said he was scared of what could happen between them. "We've both witnessed what happens to fathers and sons in situations like this," he told Andy once, "and I don't want that to happen to us." That fear motivated them to rebuild, slowly and steadily. Fue casi 25 años. Then came the statement that transformed everything. "I'm really proud of you, Andy. Él lo dijo más de una vez. Se convirtió en su costumbre." He really meant it. He wanted Andy to be aware of it. Those words from Charles Stanley were significant. Andy said it best: "The origin of a word decides how important it is." Charles could have stuck to old arguments. Andy had taken strong theological positions that upset some people. He questioned traditions, but Charles never criticized him in public. He never reacted angrily to Andy's opinions on the Old Testament or LGBTQ+ topics. Instead, he repeated those 7 words many times, and they healed something that no sermon ever could. Their last moment together was like something from a storybook. It was Saturday night, April 15, 2023, just 3 days before Charles died. Andy visited as he usually did. He anticipated the same routine, kneeling beside the chair, saying a prayer, and hearing a soft "thank you." But this time something changed. As Andy stood up to leave, Charles asked, "Can I pray for you?" That was the only time he had done that. Andy didn't realize at the time, but it would be the final thing his father would tell him. He prayed, and then he repeated it. "I'm so proud of you, Andy." Those were his last words to his son. Charles Stanley died at 7:30 a.m. on Tuesday, April 18, 2023. Tenía 90 años. He began his ministry at the age of 14. It concluded after reaching all continents via 2,800 radio and TV stations in 150 countries. His sermons were translated into 114 different languages. He preached for 66 years. For 50 of those years he was the leader of First Baptist Atlanta. He retired in 2020 and became pastor emeritus. But the mission didn't stop with him. His In Touch ministries continued and still continue. Becky Stanley Broderson, his daughter, didn't say much in public, but she experienced everything. The highs of the ministry and the lows of the family. She noticed her father's commitment to his work, but also the cost it came with. Their mother Anna started the divorce process in 1993. No fue final hasta el 2000. She later mentioned that Charles would not acknowledge that their marriage was breaking down. Becky saw her parents' relationship fall apart in front of others. Pero ella se mantuvo cerca. She was present when they wrote the last chapter. In the obituary, her name was next to Andy's. In Touch Ministries didn't just get by. It became one of the strongest evangelical groups ever. It began as the Chapel Hour in 1972. By 2017 it was on over 2,800 stations, translated into 114 languages, and reaching audiences in 150 countries. In the US alone, it aired on 500 radio stations and 300 TV networks. Even tribal communities in distant areas listened to Charles Stanley preach, thanks to satellite and digital outreach. His sermons didn't lose impact when he left his position. They became permanent, saved and ready for the next generation. But none of that completely showed the contradiction at the core of his life. Charles Stanley, who talked about family values, couldn't prevent his own family from breaking apart. His wife left. Su hijo una vez se sintió traicionado. His daughter observed the expenses of a worldwide ministry firsthand. He talked about healing, but needed to learn how to do it himself. He was brought up by a stepfather who drank too much. That strong survival instinct made him very powerful when he spoke in church, but it also made him difficult to live with. That contradiction didn't lessen his message. It made it actual.